Moving on, and let's focus on the G7 currently. G7 nations are set to meet in Japan later this week. The leaders are expected to discuss issues ranging from energy, Russia-Ukraine war, and China's economic coercion. The summit is also likely to see a joint statement by members on China's use of economic leverage abroad and tools to counter it. I caught up with Joseph Torigian, Global Fellow of Public Policy at Wilson Center, on the key issues at the upcoming G7, and began by asking him how countries will push back on economic coercion by China. Take a look.
We've already had preparatory meetings of foreign ministers and financial ministers that indicate a major topic for the summit this weekend will be Chinese economic coercion. Apparently, there will also be a special joint statement about this kind of coercion, although China will not be named in particular. It will be portrayed as a general statement, but of course, everybody will be having China on their minds.
Right. To what extent would the G7 like to contain China? And when we speak about economic coercion, their attempts at economic dominance, what exactly would countries like the United States want to check and put on the table?
So apparently, the United States wanted to include a statement about investment into China, that G7 countries wouldn't invest in things like AI and semiconductors. But US allies were skeptical about that. The European Union still talks about strategic autonomy. It's worried about the rise of China, but it also doesn't want the G7 to become an anti-China bloc.
I would also like to ask you, how much support did the US really have for its policies, for its attempts to check China at the G7?
Well, Japan, who is hosting this event, they have had personal experiences with regards to China's economic coercion. Famously, a few years ago, China banned the export of rare earths to Japan. And certain European countries have been targeted by China, and Australia, of course, faced the repercussions from China across a whole slew of different exports. Canadian canola oil also was affected when they arrested a Huawei executive. But at the same time, a lot of the members of the G7 have extensive economic ties with China, and they'll be careful about not risking them in fundamental ways, even as they think about how they might be able to protect themselves from economic coercion.
Right. In the last few days, we have seen reports about how China's Xi Jinping has asked the military to prepare to invade Taiwan by 2027. Could such an invasion happen earlier, and what could prompt it?
Well, the 2027 deadline that you just mentioned, it isn't an explicit statement that China will invade Taiwan in 2027. I don't think that there's any country in the world that tells its military that it doesn't need to be prepared for war. I think that China has good reasons to try to avoid fighting in the Taiwan Straits. I think that they understand that a war could be disastrous for them. At the same time, I think that the situation is not stable. Both China and the United States thinks that the other side is unilaterally changing the status quo. And when the United States takes steps that upsets China, Beijing feels a need to create repercussions. And sometimes those repercussions can be dangerous. For example, the military exercises that were conducted last year, if something goes wrong in a situation like that, the situation could very easily slip out of control.
India has been locked in a border dispute with China since 2019, since the Galwan clashes, and the military preparedness on both sides remains at the highest level. Can anything really change China's stance?
Well, to solve the border problem between India and China, it would require political will and trust on both sides for a give and take process. But I think that especially after the Galwan incident in 2020 that you just mentioned, those conditions are not present. Furthermore, China, I think, might find an unresolved border useful to them because it allows them to put pressure on the Indians whenever they want to and to remind them of the costs that they can impose if India gets too close to the Quad and the United States in particular. At the same time, I don't think that China wants a war with India. We've seen over the last few years still some incidents, but not deaths like we saw in 2020. So China, I think, will want to be able to put pressure on India, but also will understand that going too far may push India in a direction that China does not want.
Right. Finally, when it comes to launching of reforms, the kind of reforms and the kind of vision that Xi Jinping has, very recently we have seen a launch of a pilot project across 20 cities that aims to create a new era for marriage and childbearing for the future. This is to tackle the country's falling birth rate. How do you see this measure that has been adopted by the Chinese government? What are some of the other reform measures that countries like India will have to watch out for?
Well, this is certainly a very interesting question. We've seen demographics take headlines in a way that we haven't previously. This is the first year that China's population has decreased since the famine of the Great Leap Forward during the Mao Zedong era. And we've also seen this year that India is becoming the world's largest population. So asking about what China might do to address its own demographic crisis, which will have implications for the entire world, is something that we should look at. So it's not surprising that we would see the policies that you just described. However, as we know from people that study demographic issues, solving that kind of crisis isn't as easy as introducing a few new policies. At the very heart of the problem is the simple fact that Chinese families don't want to have children. And the reason for that is housing is very expensive, education is very expensive, the social safety net remains weak as China is a middle-income country. So whether or not they will be able to fix those structural problems is something that we'll have to keep an eye out for.
All right. And finally, India at this juncture is trying to attract global supply chains, is attracting manufacturers, encouraging many to take advantage of India when it comes to the China Plus One strategy. What kind of tensions could there be between India and China as a result of these attempts to bring manufacturing, bring companies who are thinking of an alternative to China to India?
So business people in China used to have the idea that they needed to be there. And I think that mindset hasn't changed, but has been modified because of a view that they need to have redundancies. They need to have a backup. There are multiple reasons for that. One of those reasons was the zero COVID lockdown. One of those reasons is the sense that Xi Jinping prioritizes security over development. We've seen just recently over the last few weeks a crackdown in China on consultants who go to that country to do due diligence so that outsiders know what they're getting into. India has been able to take advantage of this so-called China Plus One strategy. India has its own challenges, of course, with regards to bureaucracy and infrastructure, although India has expressed the desire to resolve those challenges. So what that means exactly for India-China relations, I'm not sure, but I think that both of them will look very carefully to see what kind of advantages they'll be able to seize as these companies are trying to maneuver the conditions that I just described for you.
All right, do watch out for our special coverage on the G7 starting this Friday. We're heading into a short break, but coming up, companies could soon find it easier to liquidate outside the insolvency and bankruptcy process. Discussion with Rudra Kumar Pandey, partner at Shardura Murchand Mangaldas, when we're back.